You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Well, how's that for an opener? Hey guys, it's Julie Yu, back with another episode of the Climate Conversations. I've got a pop quiz for you. Can you think of famous slogans Coca-Cola has used in the past? I remember one. You can't beat the feeling, from back in the late 80s. Another famous one. I'd like to buy the world a Coke, from the early 70s. Well, I could go on because Coca-Cola's been around since the late 1800s. They've got more than just Coke, of course. We're talking 500 brands in all. But we can't talk about this kind of company without talking about plastic. Coca-Cola sells 100 billion plastic bottles annually. That's 200,000 plastic bottles per minute, by the way, which means Coke has the dubious distinction of being one of the biggest plastic polluters on the planet. So let's open the lid on the world of sustainable packaging and the no-waste agenda of this fizzy drinks giant, which is under pressure to clean up its act, literally. To help us do that, we are joined by Shea Flynn, Director of Sustainable Packaging Policy and Partnerships in ASEAN and South Pacific at the Coca-Cola Company. Shea, great to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
Before we dive into sustainable packaging, tell us a little bit about yourself. What drew you into this space?
My first degree was actually in advertising. Didn't want to go that route, so I joined the U.S. Peace Corps and was based in West Africa, working in public health for a few years. I went to graduate school and learned so much about the impact of the private sector on sustainability initiatives. And it made me realize that if you want to make a huge impact, you have to go to where the resources are. And the way that our current world is designed, that is companies with a huge global reach that create jobs that are sourcing from all over the world. So I did an international assignment with the Coca-Cola Company in Nepal in 2019. Just after the World Without Waste initiative, What We Do for Our Recycling strategy was released in 2018. And it completely changed the way that I see these types of initiatives. You have the ability as the Coca-Cola Company because you're so localized and you have an impact in every market, but you have the global footprint that seeing how they were helping shape policy and how they were working to build the overall economy around recycling, but also still keeping in mind the human rights of the waste workers who were doing the collection. I just knew that this is me, this fits, I love it. I moved into the space at Coca-Cola, first working at the global headquarters on broader sustainability reporting and communications, and then moved into this role in Singapore just over a year ago, having received a lot of technical training from the team here on the aspects of recycling and how the different circular economies in each Southeast Asia country are working.
So you are in charge of packaging in the company that's been crowned one of the largest plastic polluters in the world for a number of years. Now that must bring quite a bit of pressure your way.
It does, but I think it's that type of pressure that has caused us to act, right? Like Coca-Cola is a leader in water stewardship because of some of the pressures that we felt in a lot of our markets back in the early 2000s. And that caused us to put forward a leading water stewardship strategy that is now focusing on where do we have the most responsibility and where's the greatest water risk. So when I look at the plastic pollution problem, it is a big challenge, and we very much own our part in that narrative and how can we make it better. That's why in 2018, we launched our global World Without Waste strategy with multiple interconnected goals around how do we collect a bottle or can for each one that we sell. We also tried to incorporate 50% recycled content in all of our packaging by 2030. And then we announced a goal that we want to do 25% of our volume globally in refillable or reusable packaging by 2030s. But we know that we can't do it alone. It's going to take partnerships, innovation, industry brands, working with governments to shape really good policy that's going to hold us accountable, but still uplift the overall circular economy too.
Coca-Cola Singapore specifically has been in the news for a good reason lately.
Yep.
Introducing plastic bottles made from 100% recycled plastic. So when they say 100% recyclable or 100% recycled, what do they mean exactly?
Sure. So I do want to caveat and say it's 100% recycled PET, excluding cap and label. Those are things that we're still working on. So if you take this to a recycling plant, the cap and label are recyclable, But when we're using the recycled content, we're talking about the bottle itself. The way that we've been working on recyclability first, we know that there's 7 different types of plastic packaging. You can tell this by probably on the bottom or the top.
Okay.
But those different triangles have a number in them, 1 through 7. So 1 is PET, or what our clear bottles are made of. It is the most recycled plastic in the world globally. Then there's several others. So the second is HDPE, which is what our lids are made of. This is like your milk cartons, your darker, more opaque plastics. And then there's our labels. So these are 3 different types of plastics. But when you look at the list from 1 to 7 of the triangle for recyclability, numbers 1, 2, and 5 are actually the most recycled plastics globally.
Okay.
So something that I think is really important to understand is not all plastics are created equal. Some of them have much higher value than others do. Same with aluminum or glass. You want to have a high quality material because that ensures that there's value to it. So when somebody sells it, it's more likely to go up the value chain and be recycled. So even though something has a little symbol on it on the bottom, the likelihood of it being recycled really depends on where you live.
Where you live?
Yes.
Okay. Why is that a factor?
When you look at a PET plant, all of that takes up a lot of space. So you need like 40 bottles to get to 1 kilogram of plastic. And we're talking in thousands of tons of plastic. So having the space, first of all, is really important. But that space, typically you have to have a facility. You have to have machinery that can process it. It gets turned into fiber. It gets turned into new bottles. All of that costs money. So you're not going to collect different plastics that aren't as valuable. So if I can collect 40 PET bottles for a certain amount of money to turn a profit on it versus 40 of these labels, you can just see that the economics are not going to be the same.
Okay, so the lid and the label, these are the ones that's going to be sent to the incinerators or the landfill?
It depends, again, on where you live. A lot of PET recycling plants have the capacity to shred the bottles, which we call flakes.
Okay.
And so when you do that...
Oh, it looks like little pellets.
Yeah, the lid and the label get shredded with it, and then you can separate it out. So that way the PET can continue through the recycling process, and we can sell the lid or the label, which are different types of plastic, to other recyclers. However, again, where you live, there may be a recycling plant for each of these types of plastic. That's why whenever we say we do 100% recycled content, it's because we know that in the country, there is the capability to do bottle-to-bottle recycling. But that's why in the beginning I was really clear, excluding cap and label, because that's on a market-by-market basis. I can't guarantee you that this label is 100% recycled PET, but I can guarantee you that the bottle itself is.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of the recycled PET. I think it'd be easier for our audience to understand if we are comparing it to, let's say, traditional plastic bottles, which you're used to.
Okay, so virgin PET is brand new plastic produced from fossil fuels. It has a much bigger carbon emissions footprint because you're using extractive industry to get the fossil fuels to make the PET. But when you recycle it, you're not using any fossil fuels or virgin material. It's all recycled content. We try to make sure that the specifications for our recycled content in the bottles is on par with the virgin content. So when you're a consumer and you're drinking it in the market, it's still perfectly safe. It's just as clean, just as sanitary as having a brand new bottle at your fingertips. So I'll show you, I did bring 2, call these preforms. And I don't know if you want to describe what they look like.
They look like a little test tubes.
Exactly. So of these 2, one is 100% recycled material and one is virgin material. I want to know if you can tell the difference between the 2.
Oh, wow. It looks exactly the same, feels the same texture, same color. But you can tell a difference?
I can tell a slight difference, but it's very minimal. So this one has a little tint to it.
Ah, I see.
Which you wouldn't be able to tell.
If you hadn't told me, I wouldn't have known.
Exactly. And then when the bottle is blown from this, they start, when you get a new PET bottle, it starts as this preform, and then you blow it into whatever bottle shape you want. So when it expands, you can't tell the difference at all. So that's why we use 50% recycled content across our portfolio globally, because we want to make sure that it matches the virgin PET in all of our markets. And some, we're still working on the technology. And in some, it's already perfectly applicable.
So these can be recycled over and over and over again?
So the number of times that it can be recycled also depends on the country that you're in. So Singapore, actually, we don't have a bottle-to-bottle recycling facility here. Our PET that is in the bottles in Singapore comes from a recycler in Malaysia. And it depends on the feedstock, what we would call the collected bottles after they're disposed by the consumer that go to the recycling plant. So in countries where there's a lot of segregation at source, people put their bottles in one bucket, they put their glass in another bucket, they put aluminum in a bucket, and then their other waste. Those bottles stay clean. So when they make it up to the recycler, they're a little bit higher quality because they haven't been mixed with all of the other food waste, with all of the different materials. So when you have PET bottles that are part of a system that are segregated at source by the consumers, you actually extend the life of those bottles and being able to be recycled.
Okay.
Sometimes you can inject some virgin material to extend the life. But yes, in theory, you should be able to recycle it as much as you can while the quality stays above a certain level.
Okay, so let's talk about the cost compared to traditional plastic bottles. Is there a huge discrepancy?
No. So that's something that we work really hard on, especially in our markets in Southeast Asia. We want sustainable choices to be affordable to consumers. And we know that our products, we want them to be affordable and accessible. They're not going to be a luxury good. And so we're actually trying to put our PET into our bottles while maintaining the exact same price as if it was brand new plastic. That is difficult because the price of our PET does fluctuate, just as the price of virgin resin does with the oil prices, because, again, made of fossil fuels. So another program that we do outside of just using recycled content is we try to look at the economics of collection. So when you think of a circular economy, that's exactly what it is. It's an economy. So you have a supply of the material that you want to go into a product, and then you have the demand for that product. So we try to balance it out by working on the collection side. This is our collect one bottle or can for every one sold. That helps drive up the infrastructure and the different resources needed to make sure those bottles get collected from the consumer waste and go back into the recycling system. And then the demand side, the RPET side, that's why we try to include 50% recycled content, because you're doing the collection, it's getting processed, and then you're creating the demand for it as well. So in places where there's a really advanced recycling economy and you have a lot of supply and you have a lot of demand, the prices are going to be a little bit more stable. In areas where there's very few people buying RPET, which is the case in a lot of Southeast Asia markets, then the demand for it isn't going to be there. So you're going to have to subsidize it a little bit.
All right. So Shea, in 2020, I remember that the company introduced a clear Sprite bottle with 10% recycled plastic. And in just 4 years, we were talking about 100% recycled plastic. So I must say it came a long way. What has changed in terms of innovation and technology? And is there a specific sort of packaging innovations that you are most proud of?
When you have clear PET, it is more valuable than if it were colored. So when you increase the value, you increase the likelihood that it'll be recycled. So switching all of our bottles to Sprite Clear in the ASEAN South Pacific region, which we completed in 2023 last year, all of our markets are now Sprite Clear. That was something that was within the control of the Coca Cola company and our bottlers to make that design choice to increase recyclability.
We know that recycling is still a work in progress here in Singapore. How is Coca-Cola promoting sustainable consumer behavior and also recycling awareness?
This is actually one of the biggest areas that we want to ramp up our efforts. It is essential to changing consumer behavior to know that recycling is an option available to them. And even to know that you can demand a bottle with recycled content. You know, that's part of the reason we end up putting the I'm 100% recycled labels, is because you kind of don't know what you as a consumer have access to until you see it. So again, in every market, it's different, Part of this is education campaigns with our customers. So for example, in Indonesia, we have a partnership with Grab that allows different consumers to use the Grab app to collect PET bottles for rewards. So that is designed to be a consumer education campaign. It's not going to get us the huge collection volumes that make a difference for our pet, but it is something that creates awareness. When we do our rPET launches, like we did for our 100% rPET bottle here in Singapore and Malaysia last year, we tried to do a real talks conversation where we had different experts come in and express what this means for the market and why this is a good thing for consumers. And something that we're looking at is a partnership with Simp Waste. That's a local waste collector here, to do, for now, 10 collection points around the country to try to start that consumer awareness campaign. But when we look at the results of that, how can we expand it further? So those partnerships, I think, are essential. Talking to people like you about these efforts.
For consumers, how can we make a positive impact on recycling at home?
If you go back to that cliche about, the reduce, reuse, recycle, the best thing for consumers in general is just reduce the amount of new material that you use. Like when you go in the morning for your coffee, like bring a reusable container with you instead of getting the cup and like the little plastic that you can carry around with you. Super efficient. But those are just small everyday things that stack up over time. Part of it is just using your voice. So if you become familiar with the recycled content in different goods, start to demand it. If you see some have recycled content and some don't, ask why not. What I see working for a big brand is that we both shape and follow behavior.
What's your read into consumers' behavior?
I think that there is a lot of interest in recycling. When people learn what my role is and what I do, people are like, oh, how is the recycling in Singapore? How can I do more of it? But there's not necessarily an empowerment aspect of like, I know exactly where to go to drop off my bottle to know that it's going to be recycled. When I tell people like how invested the Singapore government is in like well-designed policy to promote recycling, they're really excited about that too. But we do have the culture around the chutes and the HDBs and the different condos. And sometimes that doesn't always promote segregation at source, which we were talking about makes a difference in the value of the material. The cleaner it is, the better it is. So I would also say that really making an effort to cultivate a practice around segregation at source, which means putting plastic with the plastic and the paper and the aluminum separately for recycling from your organic waste like food would be a huge start. And then look at the type of plastic that you're buying. I know this was a very technical conversation in the beginning with the 7 different types of plastic. But when you know what is most recycled, especially when you look at number 1 and number 2, look at the material that you're getting your takeout food in, or when you go to the store and you see a 3 or a 4, it does not mean that is not recyclable. It could absolutely be recycled. It's just not as likely as number 1 or 2. So also be cognizant of like what you're purchasing in that way. I know that's a lot to ask of consumers, and I hope that as the recycling landscape evolves, it'll just become secondhand nature, but it is still a work in progress.
Okay, but some may argue, why not address the company's plastic footprint by reducing production in the first place, rather than focusing on cleanup afterwards? How did you respond to the idea of talking more about direct action at the source?
Sure. So reducing the amount of plastic in the world is the number one way to make a difference. And we know that. That's why we introduced our 25% refillable and reusable goal by 2030. But that is something that we're still figuring out how it looks in the ASEAN South Pacific markets.
2030 is what?
5 years away.
Yeah, 5 years away.
Yes. 2025 is a huge deadline for us because we're like, all right, where are we going to be in the next 5 years means making decisions this year that basically start to snowball from next year onward. But plastic is also not a completely evil type of material. Plastic affords us accessibility, hygiene, more affordability, and you lose a lot of that when you completely take it off the market. The other thing that I want to emphasize is we try to do a life cycle analysis for all of our packaging. And what that means is looking at the carbon emissions, water use ratio, all the way from source to disposal. to make decisions around what are best packaging mixes for the future. So glass can have a higher carbon emissions than PET can. So can aluminum. So it's not necessarily how do we get rid of plastic and only use glass, or how do we bring aluminum to all of our products. It's more, what is the right mix of packaging per market when you look at the local infrastructure, the feasibility of recycling, the feasibility of reusable glass bottles, the transportation and fuel cost, and how do we optimize all of those options to get the right portfolio mix per market based on carbon, water, and consumer behavior. And I think getting that mix right is something that we're still working on, but that's what's really exciting to me, and what I would like the consumers or other stakeholders to take away is, like, we know we have a duty to reduce the amount of plastic that we use. And we know that cleanup efforts are not enough. You have to do both sides. You have to take it out of the environment and prevent more from going in. But it's not as simple as just cutting out plastic completely. There has to be a strategic approach that takes into account all aspects of production to both make the best choice for the consumers to still have what they want, but look at your carbon emissions.
Shea, before I let you go, in this landscape where sustainable packaging is a shared goal, how does Coca-Cola plan to stay ahead in this realm and maintain its commitment to sustainability?
It's a great question. So yes, Coca-Cola is a massive company. And if we start using all recycled content, that is a huge impact. But what if us and all of the other brands start using recycled content? Not only does that reduce the amount of virgin plastic from fossil fuels, but it also builds the entire recycling economy. You can't change consumer behavior with one brand. We love marketing at the Coca-Cola Company, and we like to think that we're pretty good at it. But we know that we are not going to be able to influence every single consumer.
Yeah.
Every consumer has preferences and exposure, and it's going to take communication from multiple sources. And that is why we do, another big part of my job is the policy side. So we're super supportive of working with governments. It is an open invitation. We want to create well-designed packaging policy that both benefits the government's goals of reducing plastic in the environment, that empowers consumers in education and being able to know that what they're consuming is going to recycled content. But we also want the rest of the industry to be accountable too, because it can't just be one brand that's going alone or paying the subsidies to collect what we put into the environment. There's a role for all brands to play, as well as consumers, as well as even our customers that are selling at the storefronts. It is a multi-stakeholder engagement, and well-designed policy, we think, can keep all of us accountable.
Yeah, it's very clear that sustainable packaging is not just a goal, but really a continuous journey.
Absolutely.
For Coca-Cola. Well, Shea, thank you very much for coming in today and sharing your insight with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, my thanks to Shea and to our listeners. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, before we wrap up, a special shout out to Darren T84 for a thoughtful comment on our Long Island episode. He says it's very informative. Thank you, CNA team. Well, thank you, Darren, for your feedback. It means a lot to us. So remember, everyone, to hit subscribe on Spotify or Apple, and don't forget to leave your comments. The team behind this podcast is Tiffany Ang, Sian Win, Joanne Chan, and Crispina Robert. Until next week, this is Julie Yu signing off.